Hello, I'm Mike Parker, and I'm here to introduce our next speaker. Before I do so, I'd like to take a minute and make you aware of one of the free services that we offer, Fair Mormon Questions. Fair Mormon Questions allows you to submit through our website questions about difficult issues that you may have run into about church history, doctrine, scripture, events that the church is currently facing. Your question, when you submit it online, is immediately sent to volunteers who will then respond. We have about 100 volunteers on our panel. Each of them get your email immediately. You may get more than one response, which is always helpful when you get an issue where there's multiple perspectives that may be useful. And your comments and questions are completely confidential. We do not post them on a website or share them. So we invite you to use this service and to also refer your family and friends if they have questions that they need answers to. You can access it by visiting fairmormon.org and clicking on Questions and Support. Our next speaker is Ty Mansfield. Ty is a marriage and family therapist currently living in Provo with his wife and their 2 children, soon to be 3. He chronicled his own spiritual journey with same-sex attraction as co-author of In Quiet Desperation, Understanding the Challenge of Same-Gender Attraction, published in 2004. And this book was compiled in 2011 as part of Voices of Hope, Latter-day Saint Perspectives on Same-Gender Attraction, both of these published by Deseret Book. He co-directs the Voices of Hope project, an online extension of the book, and has been featured in LDS Living magazine and on the LDS Church website, mormonsandgays.org. Ty is co-founder and the current president of North Star, a nonprofit organization that offers faith-affirming support for Mormons who have issues of sexual or gender identity and who desire to live within the framework of the doctrines and teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Ty Mansfield.
Thank you. I am happy to be here today. I have to say, in speaking and giving presentations like this, I prefer to be a bit more extemporaneous. But just because of the nature of the topic, I'm going to read my remarks today. But that said, while I may not have the soul that Marvin Perkins has, I was once nicknamed white chocolate by a African-American friend of mine. So I've still got energy, I've got passion, even though I'll be reading. Sexuality is a complex and deeply personal aspect of the human experience, and issues related to same-sex sexuality are increasingly at the heart of cultural debates and discussions surrounding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its doctrines and political positions. They are also increasingly stated as reasons for individuals who are leaving the Church. For example, the recent Strangers in Zion effort encouraging Latter-day Saints to request church discipline, quote, in solidarity for other wrongfully excommunicated and otherwise disciplined Latter-day Saints, end quote, was co-initiated by the father of a gay-identified son and was in response, in part, to the proposed disciplinary action on behalf of John DeLynn, which is purportedly related to his LGBT advocacy efforts. I've been involved in conversations around this issue for well over a decade now, and in a wide number of domains, including philosophical, social science, therapeutic, and religious, in addition to it being a part of my own personal experience. I've also spoken with thousands of individuals about personal and private aspects of their journeys and have worked with a significant number of these in some therapeutic capacity. This capacity is an opportunity to get to know people at their most raw and real, where identities and agendas are stripped away, and where they wrestle with their own angels and demons, sorting out the sometimes messy landscape of their inner lives. It is because of my academic training and personal experience with myself and others that I say that the idea of being gay is entirely a social construct. Not that the feelings aren't real, but the identity and the way people incorporate that is a social construct. and it is also reductionist. By reductionist, I mean it's an oversimplification. In trying to get at the essence, instead it strips it away. Sexuality and relationships strike at the heart of the questions of identity and life purpose, and so most people have an agenda. These agendas run the gamut from more personal ones, like clinging to problematic beliefs or identities out of a drive for significance or self-preservation, a social or political agenda rooted in beliefs about social rights or social goods, or a religious agenda in which there is a battle for souls and salvation. Quote, in the midst of this war and of words and tumult of opinions, end quote, much of truth is lost. One psychiatrist wrote that nothing on homosexuality, quote, can be both honest and easy to write or read. On a personal level, the topics are bound to be harrowing. On the scientific level, they are complicated. And on the political, they are controversial. To which I would add, on the religious level, they are fraught with potentially eternal consequences. So much of the controversy happens around unexamined premises, as Dr. Muhlstein talked about today, and conclusions unthinkingly drawn or simply accepted without thought at all. Once we understand how these have harmed our understanding, we can then move to a better place to articulate a reasonable response to those who question or criticize the Church's teachings. To begin, I chose as the title of my talk today a statement that captures nicely a trifecta of social construction, reductiveness, and controversy. Quote, Mormons say you can be gay, you just can't do gay, end quote. This usually pejorative statement creates a caricature of our doctrine and practice, conflates issues, and introduces false dichotomies, and depicts the Church's stated doctrinal and policy positions as archaic, inhumane, and oppressive, not permitting people to authentically be their quote-unquote true selves. Statements like these contain more heat than light. They plague our discourse about the topic today. Once I show, or hope to show, how flawed this construction is, I will then suggest a more nuanced and useful way of thinking about issues of sexuality and relationships in LDS thought. This is important because if we as Latter-day Saints adopt what amounts to a pop cultural caricature of sexuality, we become complicit in some measure of the pain and the struggle individuals experience as they seek congruence in the context of their faith and with the gospel, because we are then inhibiting in some way their ability to live congruently within their faith. When we categorize people as quote-unquote gay, straight, or bisexual, or simply as a point along the Kinsey scale, it assumes that sexuality is one-dimensional and exists upon a single linear continuum. It is not and does not. These ideas frame and perpetuate false ideas and a false narrative around sexuality that have the tendency to reduce or politicize sexuality in ways that suck our culture into a sort of unthinking sentimentality about love, sex, intimate relationships, and social goods. So first, gayness, quote-unquote, is not, quote-unquote, being. Latter-day Saints need to understand this more deeply. I'll suggest here a loose, four-tiered framework combining components of two different models by different scholars, or proposed by two different prominent researchers. These tiers of distinction include attraction and desire, orientation or persistence of attraction, and sometimes some things are persistent, sometimes there's what researchers call desistance. You feel something or something seems to be persistent, then all of a sudden it goes away or changes or desists. Then there is behavior, and then there is identity. These are four very distinct components that have some overlapping features, but they need to be looked at independently in order to better understand them. So with attraction and desire, again, we're talking about feelings, feelings themselves on a qualitative level, and this can look like lots of different things. There's several different dimensions of attraction, why we're attracted to different things. Orientation, again, which aspects of that are persistent. Behavior, and then identity. And one of these researchers in particular is one of the most prominent researchers on gay adolescents. I believe he's at Cornell. But he talked about it's really difficult to measure homosexuality. When we're talking about homosexuality or same-sex sexuality, what are we talking about? Because there are some people may experience attraction, but they don't incorporate an identity around that. Some people, as we try to measure this in studies, social science studies, are we measuring behavior? Are we measuring what people feel? Are we measuring how they identify? Because if you show up on you get a researcher who says, are you gay or straight or gay, and someone doesn't, they may experience homosexual attraction, but they don't identify as gay, which is really common particularly in religious circles, then it's kind of like there's no fit, right? So, and they recognize that there are some people who identify as gay, but live celibate lives, and so they're not going to show up on a behavioral measure if you're trying to measure homosexuality in terms of behavior, right? So first, attraction and desire. So let's peel back the outer layers of identity, behavior, and orientation and take a careful look first at attraction and desire. Attraction and desire are complex, multidimensional phenomena. We are attracted to or desire different things for different reasons. Hobbies, life philosophies, professions, jobs, friendships, romantic partners, etc. And I would suggest that each one of these things that we feel drawn to can inform our sense of identity. Some people feel very... I did some research on like undergraduate research. It was on black farmers and some of the mental health issues that had happened with them because of policy discrimination and things like that. And there was one farmer, he could not remember, he couldn't remember his kids' names. He was about to die, there was some dementia. He could not remember his kids' names, but he knew that he was a farmer, right? He knew that he loved the land, right? I mean, it was such a part of his identity as a person that even when he couldn't remember his children's names, the one thing he knew was that he was a farmer. So identity exists on a lot of levels too. In human relationships alone, romantic or platonic, there are multiple feelings, emotions, and impulses that it is important to differentiate differentiate between, and yet we are frequently lumped together. Attraction, desire, love, euphoria, emotional attachment, meaning, and so on. As just one example, in his classic book, The Art of Loving, German psychoanalyst Erich Fromm states that often what many call love is merely desire. And desire, quote, can be stimulated by the anxiety of loneliness, the wish to conquer or to be conquered, by vanity, or by the wish to hurt or even to destroy, as much as it can be stimulated by love. It seems that sexual desire can easily blend with or be stimulated by any strong emotion, of which love is only one, because sexual desire is in the minds of most people coupled with the idea of love. They are easily misled to conclude that they love each other when they merely want each other physically. But if this desire is not stimulated by love, it leaves strangers as far apart as they were before. Humans are capable of a wide range of tastes and affinities and attractions and impulses, and I sense that culture, emotional maturity, capacity for attachment, and intimate relationships, and sense of self or identity have as much or more of an influence on how those attractions develop as do genes or biology. John Thorpe, professor of philosophy at the University of Western Ontario, noted that, quote, different people naturally have a whole array of different sexual tastes and desires. What we have done is to categorize and label these in such a way that the great divide is established upon gender as the object of desire, rather than upon shape, size, vigor, color, or social class. We have drawn the conceptual lines, and now we are the ones confused by them, or conflicted by them, end quote. He also notes that in many ways, even, quote, desires themselves have been socially produced, in that desire is often reflective of context-specific social or cultural phenomena. The fact that some African cultures see heavy women as more erotic or sexually desirable than thin women because of cultural attributions of meaning around wealth or social status, attached to weight cannot be ignored in the discussion about how sexuality and erotic response patterns develop according to subjective beliefs and values. Similarly, consider that in some Chinese cultures, muscled and tanned bodies are seen as much less erotic or desirable than non-muscled or pasty-skinned bodies because of social values and attributions around wealth and status, being a farmer as opposed to a white-collar worker. Of course, in our culture, the opposite seems to be true. People often talk about a type. My wife is here with me today, and I have sometimes joked with her that I am not at all my wife's natural type, or she's joked with me too about that. She is half Samoan, and she has always been primarily attracted to huskier Polynesian men. How could you not be, right? And add to that, they must be at least 6 feet, intelligent but not intellectual, spiritual, speak Spanish, that was her major, really funny and jokey, outgoing and extroverted. Given that what she got was a 5'10" white pretty boy who is serious and intellectual, majored in Chinese studies, is not very funny or outgoing, and is a solid introvert, and would much rather sit down with a good book on religious philosophy or psychological theory than play board games. I guess I can't blame people who think that our marriage is doomed. And yet, she insists that she is attracted to me and that she is happy in our marriage. She said that when she realized that I, a white pretty boy, was to be the man for her, and that her children would be really, quote-unquote, watered down. Those were her exact words. She felt a tinge of sadness. And yet her actual experience of learning and raising adorable children who in their miraculous individuality are anything but watered down, I think I'm safe to say that she's very happy in how things have turned out. Cue slide of the cute kids. How could you see that and not be in love with me, right? Knowing that I could give you that. We'll just add a couple more, you know. Poor little Gabriel, he had oral surgery this morning. So I would add that particular qualities or aspects or objects of desire are entirely distinct from the integral experience of attraction and desire through emotional and spiritual vulnerability and bond. Right? The superficial attraction as opposed to more meaningful and intimate experience of relationship, which can become a wellspring of sexual desire, and this can even be confusing or concerning when it occurs between men who have no inclination toward erotic attraction or erotic behavior. Sam Keen, a former editor of Psychology Today, noted in his book Fire in the Belly on Being a Man that, quote-unquote, normal American men are homophobic, afraid of close relationships with other men. The moment we begin to feel warmly toward another man, the homosexual panic button gets pressed. It makes us nervous to see French or Italian men strolling down the street arm in arm. From a cross-cultural perspective, however, it is we who are odd. Close male friendship is the norm in most societies and is usually considered a more important source of intimacy than romantic relationships. Right? That is not the case necessarily in the West, and there's a lot of factors that play into that from a social science perspective. But historically and cross-culturally, that has often been the case. I've even known men who questioned their sexuality simply because they developed a deep emotional love for another man. It seems our culture often has difficulty distinguishing deep love and intimacy from sexual or erotic desire. And it certainly doesn't help when in conservative religious cultures we use terms like intimacy, a general human good and need that transcends sexuality, as a euphemism for sex. Right? We can conflate those variables in the way that we talk about them. So someone's lacking intimacy in their lives, this is more common for men than it is for women, but if someone's lacking intimacy, lacking connection, and connection or intimacy is synonymous with sex, what do I need? If I'm lacking intimacy, I need sex, right? We have to be able to differentiate those because we all need to seek intimacy, but sex is not a need, sex is an appetite. But connection is a need, human connection. We don't fully understand the complexity of what shapes sexual desire, or how the nature and objects of desire change over the lifespan. Where we often get into difficulty in our efforts to identify or understand the what and the why and the how of sexual desire is when we try to attribute single-factor linear cause, whether that be a gene or a small cluster of genes, prenatal hormones, finger length, hair swirls, or the number of older brothers, temperamental sensitivity, gender nonconforming interests, attachment injuries, enmeshed mothers, distant fathers, peer rejection, disidentification, sexual abuse, behavioral conditioning, or any number of other factors. Any one of those has shown up in the literature in various ways, all in sometimes problematically simplistic ways. The popular cultural myth that people are either born gay, or that they choose to be homosexual, or that their homosexuality is caused by parental nurturing or lack thereof, are all reductionistic and cannot explain much, if anything, about the development of sexuality and sexual desire. It is interesting to me that our popular media culture seem to be so sure about something that science and the academy are not. The American Psychological Association's official pamphlet addressing sexual orientation concedes this point, noting that ultimately, quote, there is no consensus among scientists about the exact reasons an individual develops heterosexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian orientation. Although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, developmental, social, and cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or set of factors. Many think that nature and nurture both play complex roles, end quote. Some researchers have postured that there is no such thing even as quote-unquote homosexuality, but rather homosexualities, plural. That there are multiple subpopulations with different ideologies making for qualitatively different experiences of sexuality that all lay within the broad and diverse umbrella of what we call homosexuality or what we call same-sex attraction. Lisa Diamond, a University of Utah researcher known for her research on female sexual fluidity, with some more recent work including men as well, noted that because sexual fluidity is a general feature of human sexuality, we have to acknowledge that sexual categories are identity constructs, or identity constructs are a heuristic. They're a mental shortcut that may be helpful in making quick judgments, but which can be problematic in that they also reflect or lead to biases. I would add that we too often give people permission not to think about or seriously consider alternative questions or theories when we adopt some of these constructs. She noted, quote, we're not in fact cutting nature, and this is coming from a lesbian-identified researcher. We are not, quote, we are not in fact cutting nature at its joints. We are imposing some joints on a very messy phenomenon. We have to be careful about presuming that these sexual categories are natural phenomenon, end quote. For example, in Dr. Diamond's research, noting that most studies on same-sex sexuality are problematic in terms of sampling because they're small, non-random, and self-selected inconvenient samples, she explored some large population-based studies with large sample sizes to get a better sense for how people report exclusive or non-exclusive same-sex attractions. The following slides give an interesting view of the spectrum of sexual attraction and desire that is different from what most people are prone to think. And so just as an example, again, given that most research on this topic, again, smaller samples, and even if you have, there was a recent study that was done that had a larger sample size, it was over 1,000, I think 1,500, something like that. It was still a convenience sample that was used snowball sampling methods and ultimately is self-selected. So non-representative, and you have to be really careful about making generalizations about applicability. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time saying it. I'm not even going to try. But these are... but anyway, so these are some major studies that were done with some very large samples. And two in particular, the National Survey of Family Growth was done in two different, not two waves, but two different studies. Same study, but using two totally different samples at different time periods, one in 2002 and one in 2008. And they asked questions about exclusive and non-exclusive same-sex attraction, right? And what they came with, and I'm just borrowing Dr. Diamond's slides here, but in this, what they found, and what you're looking at here, is that on the far left, you see mostly same-sex, so when people so exclusively heterosexual is not included on this, right? Because they tend to make up the vast majority of the population. But what surprised a lot of people with this was how few people identified as exclusively homosexual, and how many people identified in this some range of bisexual, of those who experience same-sex attraction. So I think I don't know if I'm going to be able to, you probably can't see this there. Okay, so over here, we've got, this is mostly other sex, right? Both sexes right here, mostly same-sex, and then exclusively same-sex right here. Of these, this is, and then again, this is men over here. Sorry, I can't do both. For those of you that are on the other side that can't see. Let's see. But just look at, so of this, if you look at total population who experience same-sex attraction, and this is where identity becomes difficult. So to say that someone experiences same-sex attraction is not synonymous with quote-unquote being gay, because you have this broad range, and most, if you look, so of total population of men who reported in this large sample survey, and the 2008 sample, again, 13,000 people, representative, random sampling, almost exactly the same distribution here. But of the total number of people who report same-sex attraction, the vast majority, you got 7% of men and 14% of women are experiencing some measure of same-sex attraction. The majority of people, 55% of men who report experiencing same-sex attraction are also stating that they are they're mostly heterosexual, right? And 75% of women who are also reporting experiencing same-sex attraction on some level are reporting that they are mostly same-sex attracted, or mostly heterosexual. And if you combine all of those that are in the this kind of broad range of what we would superficially call bisexual, 79% of those of men who report experiencing some measure of same-sex attraction are stating that it's non-exclusive. And then 95% of women who report experiencing same-sex attraction, non-exclusive. Of those who report experiencing exclusively same-sex, only 21% of men who report experiencing same-sex attraction are stating that it's exclusive. Only 5% of women who report experiencing same-sex attraction state that it's exclusive. Right? These are much, much smaller numbers than what researchers had previously anticipated in terms. And then with the 2008 sample, it was the same thing. So again, with all of these studies, there's a slide that brings all these studies together, looking at what this looks like. So to just get a general sense for the number of people in the population who experience exclusive same-sex attraction, who are more likely to identify as gay, at its highest, you have about 2.5% of men, and about not quite a little over between 1 and 1.5% of women who are reporting exclusive. So that the 10% theory is, well, that's been kind of proven false for a long time. Like, social science have known for a long time that that's not the case. So when you superimpose exclusive onto, am I going the wrong way? There we go. So you impose or superimpose you bring those two together. The black at the bottom is the number of people who identified as exclusively homosexual. All of this up here are people who are reporting that in some way within their sexual experience they experience same-sex attraction but are non-exclusive. That's a pretty large percentage. So again, the people who are reporting exclusive same-sex attraction are a minority within that general experience. And then here, there's, again, in ways that even if we're talking about what does attraction mean? What am I attracted to? We've got, I don't know, can you even see that? But you've got different domains of attraction and aversion, from erotic to romantic to affectional. Then what was the last one? Aesthetic attraction. I think people of the same sex are beautiful. I'm just not attracted to them necessarily. I'm not I don't find them sexually desirable or erotically desirable, but I find other men or other women to be very beautiful, right? So anyway, so there's different. This is the Kinsey scale is that people often kind of talk about is not one that is very sophisticated in terms of research and really understanding the multidimensional ways in which people experience attraction. Someone might be very attracted to someone aesthetically or even affectionally. I have a friend who he's insistent that he's not gay, but man, he's more affectionate to other men than anyone I've ever met, any gay person I've ever met in my life, right? He's just so affectionate and so free with his affection, and people question, but he's like, I'm not gay, I just love men. And so anyway, so how we tease that apart and break that apart is important. We need to be able to look at these in more nuanced, sophisticated ways. So beyond just general measures of what I feel, what I'm attracted to, when I'm attracted to it, my wife used to like Polynesian men, now she likes white pretty boys. Like it's just it can change over time. There are some variables though that are going to be more persistent. So beyond the qualitatively diverse and subjective experience of attraction and desire, we have to then look at questions of persistence in various patterns of attraction or desire. Because there's a lot of fluidity and variability across the lifespan. In addition, as previously noted, the idea that gender is the chief organizing principle of our quote-unquote sexual orientation is a current social construct the dominant culture uses. But it's far from the only possible one. We could just as easily label our sexual orientation around shape, size, race, personal values, ethnic traits, emotional bond, religious belief, social class, or economic status. And there may be greater persistence among some of these other variables than the variable of gender alone, or gender preference. We are the ones as a culture who have drawn the conceptual lines. Again, they are not inherent. Anyone who is heterosexual, quote unquote, knows that they are not attracted to all or even most people of the opposite sex. And those who are quote-unquote homosexual know that they are not attracted to all or even most people of the same sex. There are many factors, the mere factor that someone is male or female is insufficient to make them erotically desirable. Therefore, some other factors or clusters of factors are more decisive than mere gender when it comes to erotic attraction. So why are we attracted to the few people of either sex that we are attracted to? And how might that inform our quote-unquote orientation? Similarly, in an article in the Psychological Review, Dr. Diamond notes are called "What Does Sexual Orientation Orient?" Dr. Diamond proposes a biobehavioral model for romantic love and sexual desire that is based on an assumption that, quote, the evolved processes underlying sexual desire and affectual bonding are functionally independent. Given, quote unquote, given that affectual components of relationship orientation do not always, quote unquote, or quote unquote, do not always agree. Meaning that just finding someone sexually desired does not mean that you will always be romantically bonded to them, or vice versa, or even romantically attracted to them. The concept of quote unquote sexual orientation particularly has been narrowly and exclusively defined by gender, is simply limited and not very explanatory or helpful. Then we move into to sexual. So there was sexual orientation, sexual behavior. It is vital to understand that sexual behavior in relationships arise from values. Sexual behavior in relationships arise from values and not the other way around. So whenever I hear someone say, quote unquote, homosexuality is not a lifestyle choice, and I hear that often, I have to scratch my head at how ridiculous it sounds on the surface of it. Anything that can be categorized in terms of a lifestyle involves some significant measure of personal choice. For Latter-day Saints, lifestyle is the factor most easily moderated by exercise of agency. Absolutely fundamental to an LDS theology is the concept that we are agentic beings who co-create our world. We are eternal intelligence who act rather than are acted upon. We are not victims of circumstance, but choose our responses to our circumstances. Given the diversity of experience and the varied persistence of that experience, for whom might behavior become a sin, or for when this is a question. Let me go back. Given the diversity of experience and the varied persistence of that experience, for whom might homosexual behavior become a sin, and for whom is it simply unfair, as some would characterize, to require individuals who experience homosexual attraction to live within the standards guiding sexual behavior and relationships as articulated by church leaders? At what point do you have to be along that Kinsey scale or that spectrum of desire before you're now bound by, because there's a lot of people talking about, well, homosexuality is not a sin, right? And there's a liberal contingent within. When I say homosexuality, I'm speaking specifically of sexual behavior and sexual relationships, not just having the feelings, right? Where do you have to be? As some would want to say that there may be exceptions, or we should make exceptions. Where do you have to be along this spectrum before it is no longer a sin, or before it is no longer inconsistent with the measure of our creation? Elder Neil A. Maxwell spoke often of the need to, quote-unquote, educate our desires, because it is the desires of our heart that will determine our destiny, not proximate human experiences. I personally found it to be much more useful to think about the education of desire, or even the education of my sexuality, than it has been to pursue, quote-unquote, sexual reorientation, which is another overly reductive concept. There was a time when my attractions to men were so strong were so strong that even though I was committed to living the gospel, I didn't believe I could ever marry, because I simply didn't feel I ever could. I couldn't imagine that. Over the course of the last 10 years, since that time, however, with growth and maturity and self-awareness, and even addressing therapeutically factors that I believe for me influenced my sexuality, the way that I now experience my sexuality is fundamentally, qualitatively different than it was 10 years ago. While I still experience some attraction to other men, my desires are such that I can't even tell you the last time I wished or I desired wistfully so that I could be in a same-sex relationship, or that somehow I wish the church would moderate its stance. I haven't desired that for years and years and years. There was a time, though, when I felt really conflicted about it. But that desire is no longer a part of my experience. If people will ask me all the time, well, if the church changed its position, would you now want to go be with a man? I didn't marry my wife just because of the church's position, on a socio-political level, or just because gay marriage is illegal. I married my wife because I love her, and because I believe fundamentally in the divine design of relationships, and that we need that marriage and gender complementarity and all these other variables are an important part of us growing into the divine image and likeness of God. Concerning the education and sanctification of desire, Christian biblical scholar N.T. Wright observed, "We have lived for too long in a world, and tragically even a church, where the wills and affections of human beings are regarded as sacrosanct as they stand, where God is required to command what we already love and to promise what we already desire. The implicit religion of many people today is simply to discover who they really are and then to live it out, which is, as has been discovered, a recipe for chaotic, disjointed, and dysfunctional humanness. The logic of cross and resurrection, of the new creation, which gives shape to all truly Christian living, points in a different direction. As one of the central names for that direction is joy. The joy of relationships healed as well as enhanced. the joy of belonging in a new creation, of finding not what we already had, but what God was longing to give us. At the heart of the Christian ethic is humility. At the heart of its parodies, pride. Different roads with different destinations, and the destinations color the character of those who travel them. End quote. Proverbs reads, when there is no prophetic vision, this is in the New English Translation, when there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint, but the one who keeps the law, happy is he. In sum, behavior is guided more by existential vision that influence our values and desires than by biology or any other factor. Identity. Being gay is not a scientific idea, but rather a cultural or being gay, quote unquote, is not a scientific idea, but rather a cultural or philosophical one, addressing the subjective and largely existential phenomenon of identity. From a social constructionist or constructivist perspective, our sense of identity is something we negotiate with our environment. Environment can include biological environment, but biology is still environment. The essential spiritual person within each of us exists independent of our mortal biology. Also, while there has likely been homoerotic attraction, desire, behavior, and even relationships among humans, as long as there have been humans, the narratives through which sexuality is understood and incorporated into one sense of self and identity is subjective and culturally influenced. The quote-unquote gay person or gay personality didn't exist until the mid-20th century. In an LDS context, people even express concern about words that are used, whether they be quote-unquote same-sex attracted, which some feel denies the realities of the quote-unquote gay experience, or gay, lesbian, or LGBT, which others feel to be more specific to lifestyle choices. What's important to understand, however, is that identity isn't just about the words that we use, but the paradigms or worldviews and perceptions of or beliefs about the self and selfhood through which we interpret and integrate our various experiences into a sense of personal identity, sexual or otherwise. An identity is highly fluid and subject to modification with change in personal values or sociocultural construct. The terms gay, lesbian, or bisexual aren't uniformly understood or experienced in the same way by everybody who may use them or adopt those terms. So it's the way, again, the terms or labels are incorporated into selfhood that accounts for identity rather than the words themselves. One might identify as gay simply a shorthand for the mouthful of, quote, son or daughter of God who happens to experience romantic, sexual, or other desire for persons of the same sex, for causes unknown and for some duration of time, for the short duration of mortality, end quote. While other persons may experience themselves as, quote unquote, gay, as a sort of eternal identity or state of being. I've heard people say that they believe that they were gay before and they'll be gay after, right? What does that mean? An important philosophical thread of the overall experience of identity is the experience of, quote unquote, selfhood. What it means to have a self, right? These are philosophical questions more than they're scientific ones. And what it means to be true to that self. The question of what it means to be true to ourselves, again, is a philosophical question. In her book, Multiplicity, The New Science of Personality, Identity, and the Self, award-winning science and medical writer Rita Carter explores the plurality of selves who live in each one of us, and how each of those varied and sometimes conflicted senses of self inform various aspects of our identity, or identities. This sense seems to be universal. In the movie Incredibles, there was a scene in which Incrediboy says to Mr. Incredible, "You always say to be true to yourself, but you never tell us which part of ourself to be true to." That's something that's very personal that we have to navigate in very personal and private ways. As a final note here, in this section, let me look how we do in time. However one chooses to self-identify here in a fallen temporal world, limited by human culture and human language, I firmly believe that like Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, in which all social and political constructs are swallowed up in the gospel stone that rolled forth to consume the nations, so will the spiritual ideals and identities of the kingdom of God and of the celestial nature swallow up all of our social identity constructs that blur our eternal identity. While I identified personally as gay for a time, at what point I had a very strong spiritual prompting that if I continued to identify as gay, I would limit my progression. I believed that the more deeply we understand and feel spiritually connected to eternal realities and our eternal identity, the less meaningful any proximate mortal identities feel to us. If others refer to me as gay, as some recently have, I typically tolerate it for practical purposes, but it is not how I see myself, and occasionally it can feel particularly oppressive when others seem to insist on projecting an LGBT identity construct onto me even after I've specified that it is not how I see myself. It's not a construct that I feel captures who I am, what I believe, or how I feel. Just recently in a media interview, I was talking to someone with the Salt Lake Tribune, and I mentioned specifically that I don't identify as gay, and the first thing she said in the article was, Ty Mansfield, a gay Mormon. Right? It's like we don't know how to make sense or to even talk about it outside of just conflating these so many ideals. And time-wise, I'm going to have to skip a whole section here, but some of these will be online. There's a whole section in which I wanted to talk about what Mormons do and kind of a revisioning what the law of chastity means in terms of this complexity and what God is really asking of us, what he's not asking of us. But ultimately, I believe that chastity, the law of chastity and the law of consecration, is intimately tied. And let me actually I'll just kind of briefly summarize this section, but I was once, because I believe that sexuality is not something we do, it's something we are, something we experience. It's just this personality is the ality of my person. Sexuality is the ality of my sex. It's what it means for me to be male, for a woman to be a woman, and how I experience all measure of emotions or in attractions, and there's a whole kind of plethora of various dimensions of experience in that. But ultimately, I believe that when God calls us to surrender everything at the altar, that means everything, and that means I surrender my sexuality. I consecrate my sexuality. And I was talking to a stake president once of it was a New York stake at the time, or is a New York stake, but he was a stake president at the time, not currently. But he mentioned, and he'd worked with lots and lots and lots of homosexually identified individuals in the boroughs region of New York. And he said in all of that time, a lot who had left the church and a lot who were active and faithful and committed. And he says, I've come to really believe over time that violations of what we call the law of chastity are as much violations of the law of consecration. Being unwilling to fully give, to fully surrender every part of myself to the kingdom, to the growth of the kingdom, and to the building of Zion. And so as kind of a further thought, the very last section, I'll close with this. People often talk about changes that they anticipate or see or think that they're seeing in the church. And that can be, the fact that the church is becoming more compassionate as a culture, which I agree that we are, and I think that's a very, very good thing, to the fact that the church used the term gay in the title of mormonsandgays.org, the official church website. Now the church is acknowledging that there is such thing as a quote-unquote gay person, which I don't believe that that's what they were doing. I believe it was a practical. It was that the terminology and the choice of wording was practical in that case. So how do we understand further changes in the church? In conclusion, even over the course of the last few years, there has been a remarkable shift in the conversation we're having around homosexuality in LDS culture. While core doctrines of the church with regard to the appropriate bounds of sexual expression have not changed, and I believe that they will not change, in terms of being appropriate only between the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage, there has been a clarifying and nuancing of church teachings, as well as a notable shift in our cultural and relational attitudes. As we consider the potential of the future shifts in the church, I suggest that it may be helpful to have a metaphor for understanding the doctrinal and historical place this issue holds in terms of continuing revelation and historical change. It seems popular among some dissenting Mormon circles to draw on analogies of polygamy cessation or the revelation on race and priesthood and temple blessings when predicting further evolution on homosexuality in the church. I believe that both of these analogies are misguided. I believe that a better analogy for understanding the church's relationship to same-sex sexuality is similar to the church's position on Darwinian evolution. Namely, that the purpose of Scripture and of revelation of God through the prophets is to tell us why man was created, not how man was created. In 1931, the First Presidency of the Church addressed the question of man's origin, stating that the mission of the Church is, quote, to bear the message of the restored gospel to the world, leave geology, biology, archaeology, and anthropology, and I would add psychology or any other social science, no one of which has to do with the salvation of the souls of mankind, to scientific research, while we magnify our callings in the realms of the church, end quote, which is expressly to bring souls to Christ and to assist God in his mission to, quote, bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. In terms of functional discourse, my understanding of the church's approach, which I happen to agree with and favor, is that they've opted for a vernacular that speaks to the base denominator, the most inclusive term, same-sex attraction, same-gender attraction, which may or may not persist to the point that it would be termed an orientation, and which may or may not be acted out upon sexually, and which may or may not be incorporated into a gay, lesbian, or bisexual identity. So that often I hear, because recently I wrote an article for LDS Living called What to Say and What Not to Say to someone who experiences same-sex attraction. And even fairly liberal factions within the church applauded what I wrote, except that I used the term same-sex attraction, right? Which is, the accusation is that it's pathologizing to the core, right? It's not pathologizing, it's descriptive. It's the most universally descriptive and academically descriptive way to talk about what we're talking about. And my belief is that that's the way we can use that term in pathologizing ways, but I don't think that's inherent. And I believe and favor the fact that the church continues to use this more all-encompassing term as opposed to projecting a gay, or lesbian or LGBT identity construct onto the many people who may not adopt that identity construct. At the end of the day, Latter-day Saints have a unique worldview that provides the lens through which we view and interpret our experience. Take that framing narrative away, however, and reasonable and sincere people may come to different conclusions about how sexual and gender variation might be best understood or responded to. As for me, I am a believer. It's who I am. The divine story of the plan of salvation as taught within Mormonism is in my bones, like Jeremiah. As Jeremiah said, quote, "The word of the Lord is in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones," end quote. It's as much of a part of me as anything. It's the narrative that liberates me and gives me life and hope, and which gives me the greatest meaning and joy. And it's the narrative through which I understand and interpret and integrate my sexuality. And that's critical to me because my desire is to consecrate fully my sexuality to God and to the building up of Zion. Thank you. Okay, so lots of questions we're not going to get to, but can we take these? Like I can maybe answer them in some other form. Okay. Some of these are almost just like and one thing that I want to be really clear about is that because of this diversity, which I've really tried to lay out, because of the messiness, the difference, the variation in different people's experience, when someone says, "Well, what do you say to someone in this and this such and such a circumstance?" I would say let's go to that's someone I need to talk to in the therapy room or a private counseling, because their experience, what they understand, what they believe, what they feel is going to be totally different than the next person. And there may be some common themes, but there's enough variation that some of those questions just have to be addressed privately and in the right way. So what counsel do you give parents who have a child who has embraced the homosexual lifestyle, who once tried very hard to keep the standards? I say love them. You love them, you include them, you do everything you can to make them feel like they are a part of your family. Not feel like they're a part of your family, to know that they are a part of your family. And ultimately, as Joseph Smith said, God will ferret out every soul, right? I believe that every single person, there's going to be a lot of paths that are walked. I just had a conversation just a couple days ago with a gentleman who had a pretty chaotic childhood. He was introduced to pornography very early. Even just recently, he was just baptized in the church a few weeks ago. He managed, prior to his baptism, for several years, he managed two of the world's largest gay hookup sites with millions of members, right? And at some point, he just retired and met the missionaries and became converted and has this really solid testimony. And one of the things he said to me that I thought was so interesting, he said, he's in his 50s, he says, I never stopped having sex long enough to really look at what was underneath all that conditioning, right? And that's what the gospel does. It helps us to peel away these layers, not just to understand what we are, but to peel away a lot of the social stuff, but then to grow into what God invites us to become. But there are people who are who may have left the church, who may have tried really hard, who may or may not. I think sometimes if I hadn't come across some of the resources that I had at just the right time, I may not be standing before you today. For whatever reason, I did. And I'm grateful that I was. But what I know is that God loves all of his children and that he will ferret out every soul. And that is Alonzo Gaskill, the title of his book, Chances Are You're Going to Be Exalted. I love that phrase. I just believe that chances are every single person, or God will save as many of his souls as he can, and many of those will be people who wandered for long periods of time away from the church. So, answer to that. Oh man, these are really complicated questions. Woo! Yeah, not happening in 2 minutes. What happened, so scientifically looking at what happened in 1999 to make the women's sexuality jump, or the dramatic increase in bisexuality for women in the graph over time. And this is something that Lisa Diamond mentioned. We don't know. I mean, there's theories about what that was. Some of that has to do with the way sexuality, like the sexual liberation, and a lot of the studies around sexual liberation and the effect it's had on men's sexuality as opposed to women's sexuality. The effect on women's sexuality generally has been much more dramatic than men's sexuality. So, I mean, there could be a number of different factors. At this point, it's all theory. So no way to really answer that question. But it's an interesting observation, and it's something that social scientists have observed and questioned as well. But good question. One more. Let's see. When do you begin to do gay? Is it holding hands? Is it kissing? Is it some other behavior? And when is the behavior a sin? I think that there is this is an interesting question. And I think it ultimately, and the whole section of this that I didn't get to that we can include online, that talks about this kind of revision law of chastity, because I believe, my firm belief is that we don't talk about same-sex attraction very well, but we don't talk about sexuality very well, period, I've noticed, I think, in the church. So I think we really need to have a healthier conversation about sexuality broadly before we really understand. And I'm currently teaching LDS marriage and family classes at BYU, and a lot of students, I mean, when we talk about chastity, this is one of the things I want to break down, because we tend to have a very behavioristic and legalistic way of understanding chastity. I mean, the word chastity means to be pure. It doesn't mean don't lay down on a couch and on top of somebody and with or without clothing or whatever, right? It means to be pure in heart. And ultimately, are we moving toward God or away from God? And so if we're going to choose an organizing principle of chastity as marriage or sex outside of marriage, then people will say, well, what happens when gays can marry? Are they not breaking the law of chastity anymore? Well, on a level of principle, if we're defining chastity or relationships or appropriate relationships and sexual expression in terms of divine plan and what God is inviting us into, as soon as I start lusting after, well, I can lust after someone of the opposite sex or the same sex and it's wrong. But as soon as I start, oh man, this is a hard question to answer. I just think that if I'm holding hands, like I was in China and they just hold hands with each other, boys hold hands, right? It's my roommate, or not it was a graduate student that I was he puts his arm around me and I just started feeling really awkward because I didn't know what he was doing. I wasn't sure if he was making a move on me or if he was showing affection. I didn't know what was happening. But there are cultures where men walk down the street holding hands. It's what friends do, right? In our culture, if I'm holding someone's hand as a friend, I don't think that's a sin. If I'm holding someone's hand with romantic intent and I'm making a romantic move on someone of the same sex, I think we've crossed a line. But it's not something I think someone needs to go see their bishop for. But I do think that it's something that they need to repent for. In terms of acknowledging where the Lord wants me to moving toward, and is this helping me in that direction, or is it distracting me from that? And, there's not more I could say about that, but...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Not very much, but it's